Standing alone in the cool autumn air, Joe felt the weight of his years firmly down on him, much as the loss he carried. 2 years had gone since Jason, his son, perished in an automobile accident. Joe's visits to the grave had evolved into a ritual since that day, his only means of being near the son who had been his pride, but also his main disappointment. As usual, early in the morning the cemetery was quiet. Joe would have it that way. Not the press, not his business partners, not his so-called friends, not even ready to discuss Jason with anyone. Joe, a man of riches and power, had always kept control over his surrounds, but no sum of money or influence could bring Jason back. Still, today was different. Joe walked toward Jason's tomb and noticed a young man, no more than 20, kneeling by the headstone with tousled dark hair and a jacket too thin for the cold. His head was lowered in prayer, hands tightly held as though he were clinging to something Joe couldn't see. Joe sensed an unexpected, strange annoyance developing inside him. This was his moment, his time to privately process loss. This youngster was here at Jason's tomb. Why was he here? Joe cleared his throat to be noticeable. Startled, the lad raised his pale blue eyes wide with something between sadness and fear. He stood up, brushing dirt from his jeans hurriedly. The lad stammered, stepped back, obviously nervous, saying, "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to. I was just..." Joe's eyes grew stony. "What are you doing here? Does anyone even know who this grave belongs to?" The lad hesitated, his eyes darting down to the headstone before they once more met Joe's. "Yes, sir, I know exactly who it belongs to. Jason was..." He stopped himself, as though not sure how much to say. Joe's wrath gave place to uncertainty. The lad had something he couldn't exactly place, something familiar. But before he could press ahead, the lad turned and vanished down the cemetery road, leaving Joe alone once more with his inquiries. Joe couldn't get rid of the sensation that persisted long after the lad left. The encounter bit at him as the days passed. That young man seemed quite familiar with Jason's grave. Who was he? Even in the peace of his estate, the questions would not leave Joe alone. Once alive, the house now seemed like a museum of the past, every room bearing evidence of Jason's absence. Joe had created an empire, accumulated more money than most could have imagined, but his greatest failing, losing Jason, overcomes all. Driven by a restless search for solutions, Joe began phoning. He talked with business people, old friends of Jason's, and even former private investigators he had dealt with. Not long afterward, he discovered a lead. William was the lad's name, and he knew Jason from a perspective Joe never knew about. From the wrong side of town, William's mother, Sarah, had been a young woman. Years earlier, she and Jason had been engaged. Joe had discounted their relationship at the time as a fleeting infatuation. Joe was unaware, though, that Sarah had been left behind with a son rather than only memories. The son of Jason, grandchild of Joe. Joe's universe whirled as he worked through the disclosure. William was Jason's grandson, not some stranger praying at the tomb. The weight of the truth knocked Joe down more than he had anticipated. He had always thought that his riches could fix any problem, and that his influence could manage any circumstance. But this was something no sum of money could correct. He had never known, but his grandson lived in poverty. The first response Joe had was disbelief. How could Jason have kept anything like this from him? Why hadn't Sarah ever told him as well? Though the questions were unlimited, the answers were all beyond reach. Joe knew just one thing for sure. He had to see William once more, and this time there would be no walking away. Joe spent no time wasting. Previously always at his hands, his resources now concentrated on one objective: finding William and learning more about the life his grandson had been compelled to live without him. Again, he phoned his private investigator, demanding more specifics on William's location. Well versed in discretion, the investigator assigned Joe a fresh lead. William lived with his mother, Sarah, in a modest section of town. Joe was driving across a neighborhood he hadn't visited in decades the next afternoon. Little homes dotted the streets, each far from the luxury he was used to. The reality of a life Joe had never personally lived seemed to weigh down the air. Pulling up before a worn-out single-story house, he found paint peeling from the siding and a broken fence around a tiny yard. Realizing how sharply this differed from the life he had given Jason, his chest tightened. Joe got out of his car and walked toward the house, practicing what he would say. The door opened before he could knock, and there Sarah, a woman he hardly knew. Though the years had aged her, her eyes clearly showed cautious, defensive, as though she knew why Joe was there. "Sarah," Joe said, his voice steady but not sure of how to go on. "Here I am to discuss William." Her face became tighter. She left the porch, closing the door behind her to hide Joe's view from inside the house. "I don't think there's anything to talk about," she said sharply. "Your life, Joe. William and I have had ours." Her words cut more than Joe had expected, though he had anticipated hostility, perhaps even anger, not the finality in her voice. After a protracted silence, Joe remarked, "I didn't know. About William. About what Jason—" Sarah shut him off. "You didn't know, because you didn't want to know. Jason was never going to be the man you wanted him to be. And he left when he realized that," she said, folding her arms across her chest resolutely. "We don't need you now. We didn't need you then." Joe clenched his hands, the guilt chewing at him. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said quietly. "I know I'm not the father Jason needed, and I didn't give him the chance to tell me about William. But right now I want to know my grandson and want to help." Though her posture never changed, Sarah's eyes softened just slightly. "William is a good boy, and I won't let you damage him. He has lived his whole life without you, without your money, without your influence." Joe drew a long breath, swallowing the knot in his throat. "I just want to be part of his life, if he will let me. I'm not here to hurt him." Sarah answered slowly, her eyes fixed on Joe as though she were trying to evaluate the genuineness of his words. She said at last, "I'll talk to him, but don't expect him to welcome you with open arms." Joe waited in silence in his great estate that evening. The difference between his world and William's tormented his mind. Joe felt helpless, first in his life. What he now needed couldn't be purchased with money. He couldn't undo the years of absence, the lost events that had molded William's life without him. The following day, Joe got a call. It was Sarah. Curtly, "William agreed to meet you," she said, "but on his terms. He'll come to your office tomorrow at noon." Joe thanked her. His voice betrayed the mixture of relief and fear he experienced. William meant to see him. Though Joe knew that this was only the start of a far more extensive road, it was a little triumph. Joe sat in his office at noon, the room suddenly feeling too large and too empty. Now that he had to create something far more delicate, a relationship with his grandson, the empire he had created over the years felt pointless. William entered when the door opened, his eyes wary and his posture stiff. William paused, staring, while Joe stood reaching a hand. William muttered, "You don't have to do that," then moved further into the room, but kept his distance. Joe dropped his hand and nodded just slightly. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I couldn't be sure whether you would." William shook, still not staring directly at Joe. "I wanted to, therefore I didn't come," he said bluntly. "I came as asked by Mom." Joe's heart fell. Though he knew this would not be simple, he had expected a different answer. With a steady tone, Joe said, "I understand. But I'm glad you're here. I know you don't know me, and you most likely don't want to. But I'd want to get to know you, William. I would want to be part of your life if that is something you would want." At last, William looked up, his eyes ablaze with a mixture of wrath and uncertainty. He demanded, "Why now? Why do you care now after all these years?" William's comments felt to Joe like a kick to the gut. How could he justify his absence, ignorance, without coming across as a man full of apologies? "I didn't know," Joe said with a faltering voice. "I didn't know you existed. If you had what?" William asked, his voice rising. "You would have swept in and pulled me out of that life? You would have made everything better with your money?" Joe started to answer, but no words came out. William's words struck because they were accurate. That was Joe's first consideration, not sure what else to think. He could use his riches to fix everything. "No," Joe answered gently at last. "But I can't fix the past. I can't change what's already happened. But I can be here now. I can try to make things right from this point forward." if you will let me." William fixed a long glance at him, his expression incomprehensible. Then, without another word, he turned and left the office, the door clicking gently behind him. Joe stood in the vacant room, the quiet once more pressing in him. Though the rejection still cuts deep, he had not expected William to embrace him right away. This was going to demand time. But Joe was ready to wait, first in years too. Joe had restless days following that. Questions about the enigmatic youngster at Jason's tomb dominated his thoughts. William was who? Why had Jason seemed so closed off? How did he know him? Joe walked the long hallways back at his mansion, the echoes of his footsteps serving as a continual reminder of the emptiness that had engulfed his once active house. Built with the riches of his corporate empire, the large estate felt more like a mausoleum now, a monument to the life he had created but could not now enjoy. The house seemed empty without Jason, as though a great stage devoid of performers to bring it to life. The meeting with William had awakened in Joe a need to know that he had not felt in years. He hadn't thought about delving further into his son's life. He had been so long grieving Jason and regretting their tense relationship. That ignorance felt like a gulf he had to cross now. Motivated by a fresh direction, Joe started his hunt. He hired private investigators, got in touch with old friends of Jason's, and even got in touch with some of the folks Jason had dealt with during his brief employment at Joe's company. The bits of the puzzle began to fit together not long afterward. William was not only unfamiliar, he was the son of Jason. Joe stared at the papers strewn over his desk, the understanding sinking in. William had been followed by the detectives back to a young woman named Sarah, someone Jason had known years ago. Joe vaguely recalled her, a girl from a low-income area Jason had visited just once. Joe had discounted the relationship at the time, thinking it was only a phase his son would outgrow. Jason had a great future ahead of him, a future Joe had painstakingly scheduled. But Sarah had been more than just a flitting interest. Pregnant and abandoned, she had been left behind when Jason had carried on with his life. Joe experienced a guilt pang not at all expected. Jason had always been pushed by him to surpass all that might hold him back. He never would have imagined that this would be the outcome, a grandson he never knew existing in poverty while Joe lounged in a mansion, ignorant of their hardships. One of the pictures the detectives came upon, Joe grabbed. It showed William and Sarah taken outside a little, run-down house on the outskirts of town. William looked younger, but from the picture, those same pale blue eyes gazed back at Joe, the same eyes that had tormented him at the tomb. How had things arrived at this point? Jason had kept this secret. How? And why hadn't Sarah ever stepped forward? 100 different questions tore across Joe's brain, each more agonizing than the next. Clearly, though, he could not ignore this anymore. Joe discovered himself back at the cemetery standing at Jason's tomb early the next morning. But this time his mind was not on the death of his son. It rested on his grandson. He still had to track down William. He had to straighten this out. Joe emerged from the cemetery determined. Though he had no idea William's life had been like, he was clear one thing: he was ready to intervene. While Jason might have left a mess behind, Joe was not going to let his grandson fall through the gaps. Not today. Not after this. Joe was standing outside the same little house where he had first confronted Sarah the next weekend. This time, though, he wasn't here to demand responses or argue. He was here carrying another agenda. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves rustling in the breeze a vivid orange and red. Joe had always been too busy to appreciate the beauty of the seasons. But now, as he stood in a place so far from his life, he felt anchored in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He carried with him a small toolbox that had required careful consideration. Joe knew William fixed things, worked odd jobs around town, did whatever he could to help his mother. Though it wasn't much, Joe hoped this would prove he wasn't here to flaunt his riches or provide ideas incompatible with William's reality. Joe inhaled deeply, then walked up to knock at the door. Sarah opened it this time, her attitude less guarded but still wary. She asked, staring at the box Joe was holding. "What?" Joe said. "I thought I could help, just casually. I brought some tools. Thought we could fix a few things around the house maybe. William works hard to keep things running here. Maybe spend some time with him." Clearly startled, Sarah fixed her gaze on him for a moment. She looked at the instruments, then turned back toward Joe. She moved aside at last, pointing for him to enter. William emerged from the rear of the house, his face incomprehensible as he saw Joe standing there with the tools. Joe sensed the strain in the room. Though it was all he could think of, he wasn't sure whether this was the correct strategy. William said squarely, crossing his arms over his chest, "I don't need your money." Joe said, his voice calm, "I'm not offering money. I'm offering my assistance." William gave a frown, obviously dubious. "Why? What do you know about fixing anything?" Joe laughed a dry, self-deprecating sound. "Not much, to be honest, but I could learn. I thought perhaps we could work on something together." William said nothing for a long moment. He just stood there, his eyes darting from the tools to Joe's face as if he were trying to determine whether this was some kind of trick. Then he uncrossed his arms gradually. William said at last, "All right. We will see what you have." Joe nodded. A tiny wave of relief coursed over him. Though hardly much, it was a beginning. They moved outside together toward the shed that required repairs. Though it was a little project, for Joe it seemed enormous. If only somewhat, Joe could feel the weight of the past beginning to lift as they worked side by side in silence. He was merely trying to be present, showing William that he was here for more than appearances. He was not trying to fix everything at once. And Joe felt like he was at last creating something that mattered, for the first time in years. While the days following that first project at Sarah's house moved slowly, for Joe they held more significance than he had known in years. Every day presented fresh challenges, not in business, but in developing a relationship with William. They kept cooperating on minor house repairs, fixing a leaky faucet, mending the rear fence, even doing some electrical work neither of them had any real experience with. Every project carried a tentative step toward something more. Though Joe could feel William's wariness softening, he knew it would take time to completely build his confidence. Still, it seemed like progress to be there side by side with his grandson. One afternoon, Joe broke the stillness by saying, "I only thought about what I thought he should be." William was silent for a long period, the strain between them obvious. Knowing that this was a conversation not one for rushing, Joe waited. "Jason wasn't like you," William said at last, his voice quiet but strong. "He demanded something different." A twirl of guilt turned inside Joe's chest. "I know," he conceded. "I never gave him the chance to show me who he really was. I didn't see it then, but I do now. I didn't understand him." At last, William turned to face Joe, his blue eyes exactly like Jason's, tinged with a mix of grief and insight. "He didn't hate you, you know," William said quietly. "He was just terrified to let you down." Joe's heart squeezed. Of all the things he had worried about, the fact that his son had lived in anxiety of disappointing him most affected him. Though in the end he had given Jason a load too great to bear, he had wanted to give him everything. Joe murmured, "I'm sorry," his voice hardly above a whisper. "I was dumb, B. About you, about everything." William said nothing, but his hard edge softened just a little. He nodded. Although it was not pardon, it was a step toward it. Joe's relationship with William developed as the weeks stretched into months. Not only did they spend more time together working on the truck or around the house, but they also engaged in truly meaningful conversation. William became increasingly open about his life, his aspirations, and the challenges he and Sarah had encountered over the years. Joe listened and discovered more about his grandson than he could have possibly dreamed. William raised something that had been weighing on his mind one afternoon as they were seated on the porch. "I have been considering school once more," William said. Interested, Joe turned to face him. "Really? What are you considering?" William shrugged, appearing somewhat dubious. "I've always liked working with my hands, but I think I might want to learn more about cars. Maybe get a degree in automotive engineering or something like that." Joe's visage brightened. "That's a great idea, William. You have a real talent for this. If that is something you want to pursue, I will help you in any manner I can." William fixed Joe, a glimmer of doubt in his eyes. "I need your money, Joe." Joe lifted his hands in imitation submission. I know. I'm not offering money. Whatever you need, either advice, resources, or just someone to talk things through with." I'm here. William nodded deliberately, his face slow. I thank you for that. Joe slanted back, a sense of gratification washing over him. This was what he had wanted all along. Not to toss money at issues, but rather to be William's meaningful supporter. Not since Jason had been alive, he sensed the kind of direction he had not felt in years. The tension that had defined William's relationship with Joe was a far-off memory by the time his first day of classes came. Watching William load the last of his belongings into an old car they had repaired together, Joe stood on Sarah's porch. Not much, but it would get him from and to school. A minor triumph, both of which they had both earned. You all set? Joe asked, his voice tinged with pride and a little sadness. William nodded and looked up at Joe, grinning. Really? Glancing at William, Joe experienced a flash of feeling. This was the moment he had been striving for, the one he had feared he might never come upon. Joe knew without a doubt that Jason would have been happy of the man William had grown to be. His grandson was following his dreams, creating his own life. Joe asked, his voice subdued. I'll see you on the weekends, right? William gave a chuckle. Yeah, I will be around. Besides, I will most likely need some help with all this school stuff. Joe grinned, his heart full. I will be here anytime you need me. Joe watched William head off from the driveway in great satisfaction as he got into the car. Not the riches or the empire he had created, but the relationships he had rescued, the love he had at last learned to offer. This was the legacy he intended to leave. Joe was on the porch feeling the spring breeze against his face as the car vanished down the road. The warmth of family and second chances replaced the emptiness that had followed Jason's death. Spending so much time building an empire, he had almost lost sight of what really counted. But now William and Sarah were in his life. Joe knew he had discovered his family, something far more valuable than money or power. And in that he had at last atonement. I appreciate you traveling with me on this emotional road of redemption, family, and second chances. Should you find great enjoyment in this narrative, click the card above to view more touching and powerful works of art. Remember to turn on alerts and click that subscribe button to never miss a fresh upload. Please leave a comment below. I read every single one and am eager to hear what you have to say regarding Joe and William's path.